The Pacific morning was still dark when Saburō Sakai, the young Japanese naval aviator who would become the most legendary surviving ace of the Imperial Navy, stepped out onto the flight line. The air at the Tainan Air Group base in Taiwan was already thick with heat, carrying the smell of fuel, salt, and distant rain. Mechanics moved like ghosts under dim lamps as they prepared the sleek Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. To many pilots, these planes were simply machines. To Sakai, they were living creatures, extensions of the warrior spirit. He touched the wing of his aircraft as though greeting an old friend. This was not yet the man the world would later speak of with awe, the man who flew home 560 miles with half his body paralyzed, the man who survived being shot in the face, the man who cheated death again and again. At 24 years old, Saburō Sakai was simply a boy from a poor farming village who had clawed his way into the cockpit through discipline, pain, and a refusal to be ordinary. He had no illusions about war. He had seen friends die in training, men burned alive when engines failed, pilots vanish into the sea like stones. Yet what propelled him forward was something older and deeper than military orders. An iron code of personal resolve. It was not nationalism, not ideology, but an unshakable refusal to surrender to fate. And that is why history remembers him as the Japanese pilot who simply would not die. When the Zero's engine roared to life, Sakai strapped himself in with practiced fluidity. The rising sun glinted off the canopy as the squadron prepared for takeoff. They were bound for the Philippines, where Japanese forces pressed their attack in the opening strikes of the Pacific War. For many of the pilots around him, this was their first real combat. But Sakai had no fear. He had trained for years for this moment, and he felt an eerie calm as the wheels left the ground. The formation soared toward Luzon, and the world turned from deep blue to bright gold as dawn broke across the ocean. The task was simple. Sweep the skies, destroy any American aircraft, secure control of the air. But behind the simplicity was an understanding that combat was chaos, unpredictable, savage, and merciless. Sakai's instructors had drilled into him that hesitation meant death. As they approached Clark Field, black pillars of smoke rose from the runways. Japanese bombers had struck earlier, and now the fighters were moving in to wipe out whatever remained. Suddenly, Sakai spotted movement, silhouettes of American P-40s lifting off desperately through the smoke, trying to survive the onslaught. Without hesitation, he rolled into his dive. Machine gun fire rattled through his cockpit as he closed on his target. The P-40 pulled hard, trying to escape, but the Zero's turning ability was unmatched. Sakai slipped behind the enemy fighter with fluid precision. He squeezed the trigger, tracers stitched across the P-40's fuselage, and the aircraft burst into flames. The pilot struggled to bail out, but failed as the burning plane plunged toward the earth. It was his first confirmed aerial victory. Later that day, he would add more, and the day after that, even more. Combat came suddenly, violently, in streaks of metal and fire, but Sakai's movements were always calm, almost gentle, as though his hands knew what to do before his mind gave commands. Within a week, his fellow pilots began whispering, "Sakai is different." He flew with a quiet intensity, never bragging, never raising his voice, never showing anything other than absolute discipline. When he scored kills, he simply nodded. When he evaded death, he shrugged. He carried the spirit of a warrior who believed his life had already been forfeited the moment he put on the uniform. Fear was irrelevant. Yet the war was only beginning. By early 1942, the Tainan Air Group was deployed to the Dutch East Indies. The skies above Java became Sakai's hunting ground. The Zero fighters dominated early battles, and Sakai's skill turned deadly superiority into an art form. He shot down fighters, bombers, anything that crossed his path. But one incident from this period would reveal the man behind the legend.
His wingmen dove on a formation of American planes. One of them, a Dutch civilian transport aircraft, refused to turn away. It was unarmed, defenseless, carrying women and civilians fleeing the chaos below. Sakai lined up his sights, ready to fire. His orders were clear: no mercy, no survivors. Yet as he closed in, he saw through the side windows the silhouettes of women and children. Terrified faces, small hands clinging to seats, a mother shielding her daughter with her own body. He lowered his guns. Sakai flew beside the transport, staring at the people inside. He saw confusion, fear, disbelief. Then he banked away and let the aircraft escape into the clouds. When he landed, his commanding officer furiously demanded why he had disobeyed orders. Sakai replied with words no one expected from a rising ace: "I could not kill those who could not fight." The officer stared at him for a long moment, then simply nodded. This was the paradox of Saburō Sakai, a relentless warrior who could kill with terrifying precision, but a man who carried his own moral boundary, even in a war defined by brutality. But war does not reward compassion, it only demands survival. By mid-1942, the tides had changed. American forces were gathering strength, and the skies above Guadalcanal became one of the most vicious aerial battlegrounds of the entire war. It was here that Saburō Sakai would meet death and refuse it. On August 7, 1942, Sakai was scrambled to intercept incoming aircraft approaching from the south. He climbed his Zero into the clouds, scanning for targets. Below, he spotted a formation of American planes he believed were unescorted SBD Dauntless dive bombers. Slow, vulnerable prey. But he was wrong. As he dove, he realized too late that the aircraft were not Dauntless bombers, but new, heavily armed TBF Avenger torpedo planes, escorted by powerful Grumman F-4F Wildcats. Before he could break away, the Avengers opened fire. A wall of .50 caliber bullets tore through his cockpit. A round ripped across his forehead, obliterating his right eye. Another smashed into his cheek. Blood splattered across the canopy, shards of metal embedded into his flesh. The violent impact slammed his head back so hard he lost control of the aircraft. His Zero spiraled downward in a deadly, screaming dive. He was unconscious. The world faded into blackness. Minutes later, how many, he did not know. Saburō Sakai awoke to a cockpit filled with wind, smoke, and blood. His face felt like it had exploded. His vision doubled, then blurred into a single foggy tunnel. Half his body refused to respond, but the ocean below was rising fast, and if he did not act immediately, he would die.
He gripped the stick with his remaining strength. Every movement sent searing agony through his skull. His right eye was gone, his left nearly blinded by blood. But he forced his Zero level, fighting unconsciousness with every breath. The long flight back to base stretched before him, 560 miles over open ocean. He should have died within minutes. Instead, he set course for home. He tied a cloth around his head to stop the blood from blinding him. When the pain became too much, he slapped his own face to remain conscious. When his vision dimmed, he shouted to himself, "Stay awake!" When his hand trembled, he clenched it until nails cut into his skin. Hour after hour, he flew through storm clouds, alone in a crippled aircraft, half blind, half paralyzed, refusing to let death claim him. Pilots later said his survival was impossible, but Sakai did not believe in impossible. As the coastline of Rabaul finally appeared on the horizon, his body collapsed. He barely managed to make a pass over the runway before crash-landing his Zero. Mechanics rushed toward the wreckage and were stunned to find him alive. His face was mangled beyond recognition. His right eye hung damaged. Bones were shattered, yet he was breathing. When he regained full consciousness days later, doctors told him the truth. You should have died 10 times over. But he had not. He had refused. Months of surgeries and rehabilitation followed. Sakai relearned how to stand, how to walk, how to use a sword for balance, how to aim a weapon. He trained until he could see through his remaining eye with absolute clarity. Commanders expected him to retire. Instead, he demanded to return to combat. In 1944, he was back in the cockpit. He fought over the Philippines, over Iwo Jima, over the collapsing remnants of a war Japan was losing rapidly. Despite the overwhelming odds, despite the decay of the Japanese air arm, Sakai still refused to die. He even survived an encounter with nearly 24 American fighters who mistook him for bait and tried to ambush him. He escaped through clouds and vanished like a phantom. But one final moment defined the end of his war. On August 15, 1945, Saburō Sakai launched for what he believed was another patrol mission. Mid-flight, he received a radio message. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The enemy bomber he had lined up in his sights was no longer an enemy. The mission was void. The years of killing, surviving, fighting, refusing death, all of it ended in a single broadcast. He lowered his guns. He flew beside the American bomber, leveled his wings, and saluted. The American crew, confused at first, hesitated, then returned the salute. The warrior who had refused to die now refused to kill. After the war, Sakai became a peaceful man. He opened a bookshop, raised a family, and spoke openly about the cost of war. He met and befriended many American pilots, including some he had once tried to shoot down. He lived not as a symbol of militarism, but as a survivor who understood the true meaning of endurance. When Saburō Sakai passed away in 2000, at the age of 84, he did so peacefully, something unimaginable during the brutal years of the Pacific War. History remembers him as one of the greatest fighter pilots Japan ever produced. But more than that, he is remembered as the man who, when death came for him again and again, simply refused to die. He carried his damaged body across oceans, skies, and decades, proving that the human will can outfly bullets, blood, and fate itself. And that legacy endures long after the smoke of war has faded.